Recently, a lot of debate has been going on about stolen artifacts. The discussion is mostly centered on European countries holding in their museums objects that they either looted or brought back, mostly from territories that were, at the time, part of their colonial empires. As the colonial empires ended and those territories became independent, the negative aspects of colonialism became more evident than ever, and many of the now independent countries have asked for their artifacts back. In fact, in 2020, the UN passed a resolution stating that all objects brought illegally from old colonies must be returned. Whether or not this should be done is a discussion in itself. I won't get into that here. In this video, all I want to do is show you some of those artifacts that were stolen or taken by one country from another. Let's start with the two on the thumbnail. First, the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone has been dated back to 196 BC, over 2,000 years old, and it was only discovered in 1799, found by a Napoleonic expedition near Rashid, then Rosetta in Egypt. Napoleon's expedition into Egypt triggered a fascination by Europe and then the world with ancient Egypt, which lasts up to today. This would be a great topic for a video by itself if you're interested. Napoleon also stole, for instance, a giant painting from Venice in 1797, which, despite legally settled between France and Italy today, still annoys a lot of Venetian people. But back to the Rosetta Stone. 2 years later, in 1801, British troops arrived in Egypt and overtook the French regime, turning Egypt into a brief British protectorate. Among the spoils of war that they took was the Rosetta Stone. The stone became property of Great Britain and remains so to this day, residing in the British Museum. The Egyptians demand its return. France at the time didn't even want to give it up, even arguing for the preferred destruction of all artifacts instead of letting them go to the British, but it's still in the British Museum today. Here it's an interesting point. Should it be returned to Egypt because it was found there and belongs to their cultural heritage, or to France since the artifact was lost and was found by them? Either way, it's unlikely that they will give up one of their most famous items. The UK is probably the best example of a country that holds most foreign artifacts in its museums, especially the British Museum. After all, it had the largest colonial empire in the world. I'm going to mention a few examples of artifacts they hold as well. If you want to skip to other countries, just use the timestamps below, because British stolen artifacts are many. Some of the most high-profile ones are the following. The Benin Bronzes, stolen by the British in 1897 from the Kingdom of Benin in what is today modern Nigeria. A collection of brass artifacts from between the 13th and 18th centuries. Most are in the British Museum, but the British have also sold many of them to museums in Germany, Austria, and the United States. The argument they often present is, okay, we took them and that's bad, but the origin countries don't have the conditions to keep them conserved anyway. However, as time goes on, that becomes less true. Nigeria has opened a state-of-the-art museum in Lagos and thus demands the bronzes back. But still, the UK says no to giving them back. Some of them belong to US museums and they have been more open to discuss that possibility with Nigeria. The Elgin or Parthenon marbles are a similar example. They belong to the Parthenon in Greece and were looted by the British when Greece was under Ottoman rule in 1801, then being moved to Britain. The British argument is that the Ottomans authorized the removal and they were the ones in charge back then. Even if that's true, Greece is now independent and they demand the marbles back. Britain said no, arguing that they couldn't keep them conserved either, but the Greeks also have a new super modern museum that would assure adequate conservation. They even left empty spaces for the stolen artifacts for all to see where they are missing, like in this display of the Caryatids of Erechteun, a set of 6 statues of women where only 5 are displayed, with an empty slot for the one taken by the British. Now, before we keep going, a quick word from today's sponsor, Incogni. And guys, this is probably one of the most interesting sponsors we have ever had. Here's the problem. Every year, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of data breaches into companies that have your personal information stored. This data can then be bought by businesses that are going to bother you with spam email, robocalls, or regular mail even, or just bother you in general trying to sell you their services. Or worse, it can fall into the hands of criminals that might leak it or blackmail you for it. Here's the good part. Legally, these data brokers that sell your info to brands can be forced to delete your personal information if you ask them to. But who knows how to do this, and who has the time to find them all and reach out individually, plus deal with the whole process? Well, here's the solution. Incogni. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. The best part is they don't just do it once, they check constantly to make sure your information is kept off the market. It can prevent identity theft and fraud, it can help you get better rates from insurance companies, it keeps you safe from strangers accessing your information, and much more. So if you're interested, try Incogni today through my link in the description, incogni.com/knowledge. You can do it for 30 days for free, and if you choose to sign up, you will get an incredible 60% discount. Now back to the video. The Koh-i-Noor Diamond is another example. Today, one of, or even the biggest crown jewel of the British crown. It was ceded to Queen Victoria when Great Britain annexed Punjab in 1849. Its name means the Mountain of Light, and the jewel originally adorned the Mughal throne. Today, the diamond is on display at the Tower of London. The governments of India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan have all claimed ownership due to historic relevance, but the British said they got it legally through a donation and will not give it back. The Maori Heads, decapitated, dried, and tattooed Maori heads on display at the British Museum, were taken as early as 1770 when Europeans arrived in New Zealand and found these items to be interesting to trade for and sell back home. Many other European countries hold some in their museums. Descendants of the natives claim these were displayed as a proof of conquest and subjugation of people, and so they should be removed from those museums. In recent years, New Zealand's government has also worked to repatriate these ancestral remains to hold them in their own museums with adequate context and respect, but many European countries still hold them today. The Maqdala Manuscripts are another example, religious texts that were taken from Ethiopia by the British after the Battle of Maqdala in 1868. 350 of them are in the British Library today and not even available to the public. An African artist even stated, "Why do they keep these objects if they can't even display them?" In 1999, an Ethiopian association was formed with the mission of returning looted items back to the country. They've gotten some back, but not all of them. And to wrap up British examples, the most ridiculous of all is a Chinese dog. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, British troops stormed the Imperial Summer Palace in China, and among other artifacts, they stole a small dog, which they named Looty, a suitable name given the origin. They then gifted the dog to Queen Victoria, and it lived at Windsor Castle until 1872. I guess this is one they definitely can't give back. Then, moving on to other countries, the bust of Nefertiti, a symbol of ancient Egypt, almost 3,500 years old, and discovered in a dig by the German Oriental Company in 1912. After that, it was taken to Berlin, where it remains in a museum until today. It is a bust of precisely ancient Egyptian queen Nefertiti. Egypt has been asking for it to be returned since 1924. They've even created a Ministry of Antiquities, which partially has this job, but the Germans have not fulfilled the request until today. Another interesting one are the man-eaters of Tsavo. In 1898, 2 lions attacked a British colonial construction crew in what is today Kenya. The head of the expedition mounted an attack and killed both the lions, keeping their furs as floor rugs until he sold them to the Field Museum in Chicago in the US for only $5,000. Kenya has demanded their return, but the US, and the museum especially, doesn't seem too eager to do so. Speaking of animals, next is the Zimbabwe bird, although this wasn't a real animal. In southeast Zimbabwe, near the city of Masvingo today, are the ruins of the palatial complex of former king Munhumutapa. In the front of it, there used to be 8 large stone birds. At least 6 of them, however, were stolen by colonizers and looters, then ending up in South Africa, a British possession at the time. Today, the birds hold such strong cultural significance to independent Zimbabwe that they even appear on their national flag and currency. Almost all of the missing ones have been returned, but one of them remains in South Africa in the personal museum of Cecil Rhodes, an imperialist that founded the colony of Rhodesia at the time. South Africa keeps the bird and doesn't seem to want to return it. Then Priam's treasure, held by the Russians but claimed by the Turkish. Priam's treasure is a set of gold and other valuable artifacts. They were found in northern Turkey in 1873 during excavations led by the German Heinrich Schliemann to find the old, ancient, legendary city of Troy. The excavation's legality was questionable even at the time, evident by the fact that he had to smuggle his findings out of Turkey into Germany, and they were shown at the German National Museum for a long time. However, during the end of World War II, fearing that these would be destroyed, the museum handed them over to the Soviet Russians. The treasure was flown to Moscow, where it remains today. Turkey has repeatedly asked for them back, but Russia has passed a law stating that it was acquired legally and so it cannot be returned. And also the Bangwa Queen, which is a great example of an artifact being taken and then changing hands. This one is a sculpture of a woman from Cameroon. A German explorer came into its possession either as a gift or by stealing it and took it back to Germany in 1897, being stored at a museum in Berlin. The museum held the work until 1926, when it was first sold to an art dealer, then exchanging hands between various private art collectors. The latest one and current owner is the Dapper Foundation of France, which purchased it for $3.4 million in 1990. The descendants of the Bangwa people have claimed they want it back, but the foundation seems to refuse and simply stated it will continue to seed it for exhibitions around the world. Portugal is also an example of a country that holds many artifacts they took from African territories, mostly from their old colonies. While I believe none have been returned yet, the Portuguese government has begun composing a list of all to evaluate which should be returned. Their argument is that they can't return them yet because an inventory was never made. They definitely exist, but they don't know which ones or how many. In France, they do know, and there are about 90,000 African artifacts, and they have begun being returned. In 2019, the French president returned an iconic Senegalese sword to the president of Senegal. The sword had been taken in the 1850s by French colonists in West Africa. France has also returned some ancient Egyptian frescoes from the Louvre, and many artifacts to Benin, which they had taken from the old kingdom of the Homi. And this is a good transition into another topic because French President Emmanuel Macron, in a gathering with students from Burkina Faso, stated that it's unacceptable that so much of Africa's cultural heritage is stored in France and must be returned, something that is also a consequence of France's vast colonial empire in Africa. France seems to be leading the way in this repatriation of historical artifacts. They even ordered a report to be made to outline the process of identifying these objects and then returning them. According to that report, over 500,000 historic African artifacts are held today by European countries. However, some of them are in private collections, some of which are owned by Africans themselves that live in Europe, like the African Art Gallery in Lisbon, but this is a minuscule percentage when compared to the country's national museums. A lot of European states have made it a point to return artifacts only to African governments themselves and not to private African collectors to make sure that if they are being returned, they actually end up in Africa accessible to the African people. Because we also have examples of other countries that came into possession of stolen artifacts through purchasing them from private collectors, but returned them as soon as they found out their origin. The US are surprisingly an example of this. They held some statues from Cambodia, which they then found were illegally brought from the country and returned them. An ancient Greek vase, the Euphronios crater, illegally excavated from an Etruscan cemetery in Italy. It was part of the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York from 1972 to 2008 until it was repatriated to Italy. Again, here Italy was chosen as the origin point instead of Greece. And also a golden sarcophagus that they had from Egypt, which again, when they found was illegally taken, they gave back to Egypt. The return of stolen artifacts is a logical thing, in my opinion. During World War II, the Germans also stole thousands of pieces of art across Europe, which were then returned after the end of the war. In many cases, the countries like France, so it only makes sense that they understand how it feels to have your historical objects, artwork, and heritage taken from you and wanting it back, thus leading to their return to the rightful owners. Germany has also returned over 500 objects to Nigeria and Cameroon, and even the UK itself has agreed to return 213 of those Benin Bronzes, as well as 7 antiques to the government of India. Japan plans to return over 1,200 historic books to Korea, and New Zealand, the US, and Canada have the odd case of returning artifacts to communities within their own countries, in each case, artifacts that belong to the native peoples and their descendants. The act of returning artifacts to their original owners seems to be a tendency across the world. So, those are some of the artifacts that countries have stolen or taken from each other, and how some of them refuse to give them back, while others have begun doing so. What do you think? Should they be returned or not? And what are some other examples of stolen artifacts? Does your country hold any or demand any back? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.